But I do want to tell a little anecdote, a very sort of Thomas Friedman, I talked to a cab driver yesterday anecdote. I was in the Uber coming from the airport to the hotel, and I was telling him about this conference, my driver, and I was mentioning that I was going to be moderating a panel about the effects of AI on the labor market and the ways that cash can potentially be a solution to some of the sort of transitional problems we're going to face. And he said, actually, I know all about that. And I said, yeah, like, you're a driver. You must be thinking about automation all the time. And he said, no, I'm a product manager, and I already lost my job from AI. So it gives you a sense of the sort of spectrum of problems that we might be facing, of transitions that we're looking at. In another way, you might think about it as a set of opportunities that I think all the people in this room, all the people at this conference are excited to be looking into. So we're going to dive into a lot of that today with the panel. With us, we have Rayan Semery-Palumbo, who's working with the SEIU to study how guaranteed income could support drivers with the rise of autonomous vehicles. We have Taylor Jo Isenberg, the executive director of the Economic Security Project, who recently released a paper outlining the key interventions needed to make AI work for everyone. And finally, we have Anna Yelizarova, co-founder and COO at Windfall Trust, a nonprofit focused on the economic implications of transformative AI and the policy responses needed to navigate the transition. Taylor Jo, I want to start with you. So I can't be the only person who sort of first started hearing about cash and guaranteed income from people in Silicon Valley. The idea of universal basic income, or UBI, as a potential for technological job displacement. What has changed about that conversation since you started the ESP 10 years ago?
I think the answer is everything and nothing. So, when the conversation 10 years ago was focused on cash and technological displacement or automation, it was really actually looking at the rise of gigification and the fact that we were seeing an increase in jobs in which we're not paying enough for people to make ends meet, and so we might need to be more creative about the tools in the toolbox to do that. ESP at the time grappling with that trend, I think you did see some of the early, more intense than we see now, around like, well, just in case work disappears, we should also just give people money. I think our sense was that was not the actual answer to the question. And in fact, that the foundational rationale for guaranteed income was actually being attuned to people's lived experience right now, that we didn't need to project some potential future to justify the idea or the intervention. And some of that came back to, again, just understanding how our social safety net was failing millions of people right now. And that the fact we had this rich and powerful history around cash and guaranteed income, rooted in the civil rights movement. And so we could look through the lens of justice, look through the lens of dignity and worth to say this is something that we should be pursuing now. And for us, using guaranteed income language versus UBI really was a rhetorical and a substantive choice, which is to say, no matter what is happening, there should be some kind of income floor that people don't fall beneath. And I think the conversation around and Silicon Valley role in this, they very much are driving the labor market displacement part of that conversation, and I think part of what is important we continue to broaden beyond that.
Anna, you did a paper recently where you and I were talking about this a couple of weeks ago, that people want jobs, not full UBI. Is that right?
That's right. So I live in Silicon Valley, so I'm also very close to the narrative we're discussing here. And I mean, anyone could go on like OpenAI's charter page right now, and you would see that embedded in their mission statement is that they want to create AI that will outperform humans at all economically valuable work. This is like word for word what the tech industry is aiming for, and they're very forward about that. And UBI is kind of the, it's okay, we won't need to work, we'll, pursue our passion, spend time with family, sing songs around a campfire and write poetry, and I'll get UBI. But then, we spend some time actually doing the napkin math and trying to understand, well, okay, if you take that narrative to heart, how much would we actually need to sustain a population on redistribution alone? Is this even feasible? How far are we from the conditions that would make this possible? And I mean, the short answer is globally, we are so far from that. If we divided all the wealth in the world by the number of people alive today, most people would not have nearly enough to, live on. In the US, just to give you an order of magnitude, I think if you tried to get every adult in the US to like a poverty level subsistency wage, like maybe $30,000 a year, you'd be talking at about a $8 trillion price tag, and our government revenue is closer to 5 right now. So, you know, we would have to grow the economy a significant amount to even start to entertain that narrative. And there's a lot of questions about, you know, what would happen in the meantime. Today, you know, we're already starting to feel some of the effects of AI, and there's a lot of questions around transition policy and how do we support people in the interim if we don't see these, you know, crazy growth numbers right away or ever. And so the way this community here speaks about UBI is meaningfully different, or guaranteed income, which is like something to, you know, complement, to support you, to catch you. So you don't have to work 3 jobs, but it's there to complement. And the way it's being talked about in Silicon Valley is essentially the solution to strive for. And we ran some surveys to see if people actually liked that. And the short answer is people prefer jobs. If they were asked, like, you know, what kind of future would you want to live in, people preferred futures with job guarantees than with kind of this fully automated UBI future. And when they were asked what would AI need to do to be beneficial to your community, maybe the top answer was the creation of jobs. So there's a big kind of friction between what's being built and what people want that is worth acknowledging.
Yeah, I mean, one of the themes, both of these answers so far, and I think throughout this discussion today, is this sort of distinction between cash as a kind of pittance given to people who have been put out of work, surplus populations, so that the Sam Altmans and Elon Musks of the world can live high on the hog, and the question of cash and guaranteed income as a way to, you know, create a floor that people can live dignified lives on top of, you know, given especially that so many of the profits that the AI companies are making come from work that we've all done. And if I can stick with you for a sec, so your work at Windfall is about scenario planning, about the sort of not so distant future, the transitions that we're talking about. Can you, like, for the context of this conversation, can you sort of paint us a picture what the latest thinking is around who's most exposed, the kind of timeline we're looking at?
Sure. So I will start by saying I won't make any claims about like dates or you know, which jobs are going to go first. The thing I worry most about is that we're only converging on the most popular or likely scenarios and the kinds of policy we're entertaining. And I think this is one of those times in history where like the cone of possibility of like where this technology is heading is just so wide. Like this could be another technology like the internet, or we could be talking about like mass unemployment. And there's a lot within that range, from like AI augments a lot of work and some people get outcompeted by other humans, you know, who leverage AI better, all the way to we have kind of a drop-in remote AI worker that can wholesale replace a human. And I think if we're only like focused on the most likely, most popular possibilities, we will be very unprepared for the range of possibilities. So this is the kind of work we do. It's less predictive, like we're not forecasting, we're planning for different outcomes. And we're also, we have a global mandate. So we're looking at this from different country perspectives, doing cross-country analysis. And I mean, what I can say about the US here is that, like, I mean, structurally, we both have strategic advantages. Like, it's very likely a lot of this wealth will be concentrated and created within US borders and US companies. But at the same time, our institutions are very, very vulnerable. And what I mean by that is, you know, if we see enough job displacement, right now, it's like our healthcare is tied to employment. We have little to no unemployment insurance. You know, we have very leveraged housing markets and a lot of debt. And when you compare that to, I don't know, Denmark, where you have 2 years of unemployment insurance at 90%, like there's a 2-year like buffer where your institutions are giving you time to respond because this money is still there's income replacement and this money is still flowing into the economy. But in the US, like you start to get the strain much quicker. And, you know, if enough people lose their jobs, like consumer power goes down, there's a strain on supply and demand, like this causes ripple effects. And right now, institutionally, I think we have probably the weakest safety nets, which could lead to these like trickle-down effects on all fronts.
Yeah, I mean that's when we talk about opportunities. I mean, this is part of what we're thinking about as we face this transition, potential transition, is how can we also see the challenges as ways that we can step in with solutions that we know will give people the dignity and the power necessary to live the lives they deserve to live. Rayan, you've been working on a project with drivers, probably one of the most exposed group of workers. Can you talk to us a little bit about why they're a useful test case and the kinds of direct cash policy that you think would help in the event of an AI transition?
The stakes are huge. That's just what I've picked up from these initial remarks by TJ and Anna and Max. And the stakes are huge of AI, not because the challenges are new, but because AI makes the same old challenges much more urgent. It's because we've not yet figured out how to guarantee prosperity and security for everyone. So something that disrupts labor markets and makes a stable, good job even harder to come by, it accentuates all the problems we already have. And something that I really appreciate about this conference and about today is, you know, I think we've all probably attended talks or Zoomcasts or panels on AI, and the focus is on it as this new shiny object, as if it's representing brand new challenges for our society, when in reality, again, it's just accentuating or making worse the same old challenges. And just for me, I come to this work, I grew up super broke and grew up with a single mom, and she worked in the service sector primarily, and as we know, service sector jobs pay poverty wages. So we spent years homeless, struggled to get by. My mom then ended up in call centers, and call centers in Arizona at the time were a stable source of work. She's a kind person. She likes speaking to people, so she was good at that work. Then in 2024, I think everyone's heard this recording, right? This call will be recorded for training and quality purposes. In 2024, her company got enough of her recordings to replace her and everyone like her. So since then, she's struggled to find full-time work. In some ways, there's been a partial silver lining. She's always wanted to work with children. She now works at a school, but she gets 12 hours a week and can't go up from there. So she was already low income, and now the floors dropped even further. And again, that's the concern of AI. That the jobs that humans can do, like taking care of children at a school, those jobs pay poverty wages. So when the jobs that AI can do go to AI, humans end up in sectors that don't pay enough to survive. And that's what we have to fix. And I think that's part of the promise also, is we can create a society where we do human work and connect with each other and use our humanity in our work. But we have to pay those jobs properly.
But I still want you to talk about your drivers.
And I think drivers are just a really interesting example of this, where, of course, the initial, the structure of our project is asking the question, what would it look like to have a just transition? What would it look like for workers to control the way that new technologies emerge in their industry? Especially, of course, knowing that those workers made that technology possible, built the industry that Waymo, which of course y'all see the Waymos around Austin, which is an autonomous self-driving vehicle company owned by Google. Taxi, Uber, and Lyft drivers, they built the rideshare customer base that Waymo is trying to profit off of. So how do we implement a technology? How do we use public resources to receive a technology in a way that makes workers' lives better than, as opposed to worse? And I think, of course, the reaction for many drivers is primarily fear, that they have no reason to believe this will make their life better. And I think that's the interesting policy question, is how can government use its leverage over roads and vehicles to require that the profit Google makes benefits the workers, maybe allows them to work less and earn more, to spend more time with their family. and do work that hurts their body, do work that I think many of them by the 9th or 10th hour want to stop doing.
So let's talk about another sort of potential policy solution that interrelates with cash in interesting ways. Taylor, Jo, I'm hoping you can tell us a little bit about the idea of a data dividend and what the appeal of that approach, I think both substantively but also kind of narratively, why that's an interesting path.
Yeah, so you hear, for many years, people have talked about the idea of a data dividend. I think more often than not, you hear it now described as an AI dividend. And the idea is actually quite rooted in something that's real in the world. So Alaska in 1976 established something called the Permanent Fund, which was essentially them taking their oil revenues and putting them into a fund to generate income over time, with the understanding that this was shared wealth, that the natural resources of Alaska were for all Alaskans, and therefore it should benefit all Alaskans. And then a few years later, in 1980, they passed the Alaska dividend. So in short, every single year, based on how much the fund is making, they distribute a check to every single Alaskan. It's extremely popular. It is extremely politically resilient. There have been people who've tried to get rid of it, and they have not been able to do it. And it does generally have a positive impact on the state of Alaska. Alaskans feel so proud of their identity, of their connection to the land, and a lot of that is rooted in the dividend as being the physical manifestation of that. Now, it has these side effects in terms of there is lower poverty rates, particularly in high poverty areas. You know, Alaska has a lot of deeply rural communities, a lot of native communities, where this dividend is really a lifeline. And so I do think you also see some of what we all know in this room, the positive benefits of cash, but I think the differentiating factor from other models is this shared ownership component. So I think what I like about the AI dividend conversation is challenging our notion of what redistribution can look like and how people experience that redistribution. Again, one of an earned, an inheritance, and a right, and our collective responsibility and our collective ownership. What makes me nervous is that it's not a solution for, I think, the big questions that we're asking around AI, right? Which is one of which, how do we, if people are actually have jobs, we continue the trend, accelerate the trend of jobs where people do not have enough wages and enough income. Again, to the math point, like a dividend's not gonna solve that, particularly one that's structured in a universal way. And again, I think there's some creative ways to think about dividends structured more like a negative income tax, where you are actually getting more of the funds to the people who need it the most or the most impacted. But I think this is why it's really important when we have these conversations around AI's impact, not just on labor market, but the economy, is to really internalize now that there is going to be no silver bullet for how we navigate this particular moment. One of the goals of the brief that we released, ideas for a shared prosperity in the age of AI transition, was to say that there needs to be thinking on all fronts. And in fact, as Rayan did a great job just laying out, there's a series of no-regret ideas and steps that we can take now that are just fixing what's already broken and will make us all more resilient and better prepared for whatever transition happens, by the way, whether it's AI or climate or other unexpected ones. And so that's why I think we were trying to say, hey, like to the point, we don't have to wait for the debate to play out between the industry, which is saying we're gonna have mass job displacement, and the economists who say, it's gonna be fine, we've been here before, which, by the way, they talk about where we've been here before. They're talking about the Great Depression, which we were not all fine. So just keep that in mind every time the economists tell you to chill out and be okay. That there is a set of things that we can do, and I think it goes back to, again, fixing our tax code. We should do that. We should tax rich people more and get more income to folks who need it. We should decouple the fact that our health insurance comes through employment. That is not working for millions of people right now. And it's, again, AI could only potentially make that worse. We know that we need to tackle the concentrations of wealth at the top. Antitrust law is one thing that we can deploy right now to fix those things. So I think that's one of the things that I think is important, and where I hope the conversation continues to go is out of this binary conversation. And as Anna laid out, it is often, should we have guaranteed income or UBI or jobs? And I'm like, that is the wrong conversation to be having. And so my hope is that we'll continue to push forward on, again, what are some of these no regret solutions that we can move on now? And how do we deploy a full toolbox and start to really understand what the full toolbox could be, again, to make sure not only that people are whole through whatever transition is, but we do make this about shared prosperity and dignity and all of us actually benefiting from whatever shared future we want to be a part of.
Yeah, I mean, it seems really clear that we talk about AI, and it's really important, I think, to be specific about the kinds of effects it'll have because it helps us design policies. But provided that we keep our North Star as worker power, worker dignity, the idea that everybody deserves to live a life and to benefit from the fruits of their labor, means that we don't have to sort of back ourselves into a corner about some really specific kind of AI policy. One thing about the data dividend that I think is really interesting is the extent to which it underlines the fact that AI is a collective endeavor, that it is trained, as I think most people know at this point, that every chatbot you use is trained on terabytes and terabytes of words that people have written, words that people have said that have been recorded somewhere. I'm a journalist. I know that my stuff is inside ChatGPT and Claude, that when it's giving people answers and increasing productivity, part of that is because of stuff that I did. Part of that is because of things that you guys posted on Reddit or Facebook or wherever else. And I think the data dividend nicely kind of underscores that this is something that we collectively did, that just because you're Sam Altman's and you're Elon Musk's, not to keep going back to those two guys, but they really are two perfect sort of avatars for what's going on. That it's not that they are in particular geniuses that made this, but they have found a way with a bunch of very smart machine learning experts to harvest the human knowledge that we've all built. And the data dividend, I think, acknowledges that in a sort of policy way.
Yeah, just a bit on that, I think part of, again, the example and the parallels between the Alaska dividend and AI dividend is like, for the average Alaskan, one can of oil doesn't really do much for them. But again, getting a $2,000 check a year, this shared fund that, again, pays out year over year, generation over generation, again, demonstrates a collective piece of this. We're in a lot of conversations. Do we have any artists in the room? Yeah, I'm curious. So one of the things is, one of the hot topics right now is Hollywood has really led on this, largely, again, because you have labor unions who are really trying to drive this conversation. There have been some settlements that have come out between the big publishers and AI companies, because the AI companies essentially trained their data sets on all the books that have been published in these authors. And it's, I think, in some cases, like $10,000 per book is what the settlement is. Like, that's not gonna actually supplement, essentially, the collective knowledge that an author or an artist has put into the system. And half of that goes, by the way, to the publishing company. Only half of that actually goes to the author. And so I think, again, this idea of recognizing that there's a collectivism being sucked up into the models, and then thinking about the collective output, because I do think a lot of the solution set is going into how do we target each individual agency or industry or person potentially impacted. And I think actually, in fact, that has really failed us in the past in terms of, again, helping people weather these kinds of storms. And I do, again, think about some of these universal or more collective-based responses feel important for the moment.
Yeah, I did. I calculated based on some of the settlements or the deals that OpenAI has with the New York Times and other publishers, how much each one of my words is worth to them, and it's like 1/10 of a cent at best. So to me, it's much better to link arms with everybody else whose words are also in there, and to encourage that some of the money being created in the productivity gains that we're supposedly going to get comes back to us. So part of what we're talking about here, obviously, is narrative. We're talking about a bunch of different ideas and policies, but we're also talking about how these are being framed and presented to people. I mean, this is for all of you, really, but maybe, Anna, we can start with you. Why is it important to find the right narrative frame, and how are you approaching the idea when you're thinking about it?
Yeah, the story we tell about why we might give people money does matter a lot. We actually asked this question in the same survey I mentioned earlier. Essentially, we said, like, let's say you're managing a fund, you're choosing who to give money to, how to prioritize, et cetera. What justifications resonate the most with you for why you should receive money? And the top answer was, it's built on a collective share of human knowledge, and this is kind of a right. That scored more highly than compensation for data or offsetting harms of automation. So that was the more popular one, and I think it's also the one that kind of rings with the most dignity in a way. And it's similar to what you were saying with how people relate to the Alaska fund.
What about you, Rayan? Thinking about narrative here in terms of how the work that you've done.
I definitely, again, start with my mom again, and I'm going to bring in a new familial character. I hope y'all are willing to accept him. His name is Joe. He's my mom's boyfriend. He worked in trucking and manufacturing in Arizona, and then 2008, 2009, a lot of those jobs left the United States. So he lost his first career to outsourcing just at the time that he was, aging into a management role where he could start using his mind instead of his body, and his body was starting to break down. Those jobs left in 2008, 2009. He did what America wants him to do, which is he fought back, he picked up the pieces, he found a second career in call centers where he met my mom. He was a manager, and then, of course, he lost those jobs also when those jobs were automated. So my mom and Joe, to me, are just examples of what happens far too often in this country, which is people do the essential work that makes our country possible, and then the moment they're no longer profitable, our system abandons them. So when I think about cash arriving in the mail to my mom and Joe, it would be so valuable for them to receive $2,000 a month, $1,000 a month. And also, if it were just framed as a random act of charity from a nonprofit or a philanthropist, I mean, they'd take the money. They might not. Like, Joe rejected all this COVID stimulus checks because he experienced it as a handout, and he's one of the Americans who doesn't take handouts. So they might take the money, they might not, might help them. But if that same amount of money, $1,000, $2,000 a month, arrived to them with a story that's also the truth, which is you have worked for decades to make this country possible, to make innovation possible, and this is money you should have had a long time ago. This is money you've earned. This is money you deserve. I think literally just that letter attached to the check would make them start to feel whole again, which is my work did matter, and maybe my country does fulfill its promises. Maybe my country does care about making wrongs right, and that's why narrative matters. That's why the story matters. And just quickly, on the flip side of this, where there are tech billionaires, there are suspicions. So why are tech billionaires so supportive of UBI? And of course, let's see how far that support goes. Will they lobby for it? Will they support it if it's up to a vote? But why are they so supportive? I think that's because the status quo in America, the expectation, the way our narratives would level up to a UBI, is that you have the innovators, you have the smart people, you have the people who've transformed America, and we'll accept some taxes to give back to the people who lost, the people who aren't good enough to keep up in this new economy. We'll be generous, we'll give that gift back. I think billionaires maybe support UBI because they know it'll maintain their narrative power.
Modern day noblesse oblige.
Can I add something?
Please.
Just on the point you made about, the feeling like your work has, supported this country, and it is true. Like when you look at government revenue in most countries, the majority of this is composed by income taxes, payroll taxes, like the great majority. And the wealthiest, the billionaires, have very small salaries, and a lot of the wealthiest corporations are finding like every possible tax loop to pay less and less. I think in the 1950s, corporate tax used to represent closer to 30% of government revenue. Now we're at like 9%. And so it is true that people like your mom and Joe, are like every little dot is contributing to a greater whole. And this is also something we should worry about. If enough people lose their jobs, it's not just individuals getting disempowered, it's your government, your institutions as well. Because suddenly if, your government sees their revenue shrink, they're gonna struggle to support a lot of these safety nets, welfare programs. And so what's important in the AI conversation is also like rethinking taxation and what does that look like if AI is able to do more and more of the productive work, and both the narrative around that and like structurally, how do you make that work? Because maybe in a transition, you might be able to tax the very AI-augmented, very productive sectors to then funnel some of that money towards places where we have labor shortages or really low wages, I don't know, be it in healthcare and in teaching, things that everyone values as societies, but markets seem not to. So there's definitely an opportunity there around how do we do this well, and I think it will also start with taxation to make sure we can support the kind of programs we're talking about.
Yeah, just to build on this, I reflect a lot on this question as well. So similar to Rayan, a large reason I do this work is because of my family's experience, and similarly had parents who was so important to them to never be perceived as receiving handouts. It wasn't until my mom had passed away that I learned that my early life was my parents were on SNAP and WIC, but if you had ever asked her over the course of her lifetime, absolutely not, never took a dime. And it goes back, it's shame. It's this sense of like, again, I should be able to make things work. When the 2008 financial crisis hit, which I think, again, we can look back to some of these recent crises in our lives to understand kind of potentially what could be happening moving forward. My dad is a drywall guy. He had built a small business in Charlotte, North Carolina. His primary market was first-time home buyers. So he was the guy who was hired by the big builders to come in and do the drywall. And for him, it was a craft. It was like a purpose. It was a sense of like, this is my way of contributing. And there was nothing more important to him than providing for his 3 daughters. So for those of you who remember the financial crisis, the subprime mortgage lending crisis was largely driven by first-time home buyers. And so that market crashed pretty much overnight. And so this entire business he had built was gone. And my parents had co-run it. And they never recovered from that. And part of the reason they never recovered from that is because they were unwilling to declare bankruptcy, because they were determined to pay every single dime of debt. The big builders declared bankruptcy. And so they got out. My dad was left with the bills to pay his subcontractors. And so when I think about, and again, I think the part of the story for a lot of us coming out of that crisis was a lack of accountability for those who actually caused the crisis and then who actually got out and was taken care of. And again, the line was Wall Street took care of Wall Street, but they didn't take care of Main Street. And that was 10 years of my parents really losing their way, right? And again, we talk a lot about the financial realities, but again, this is about people's sense of purpose in the world and how fast do we take action to put them back on track? How do we de-shame some of these things and to say, this wasn't your fault. Like you played the playbook, right? The American dream said you work hard, you get ahead. And we have so embedded in that into people's own minds that when they're hit with something that's completely outside of their control, they take on that shame and responsibility themselves versus blaming the system. And I think that's why a lot of the narrative work ahead of us is to shift that mental model, which is to say, this was not your fault. This was the system's fault. And if you keep trying to do everything that you want to do to try to put you right back on track, we're going to be there for you, which has not been our response to shocks and crises in the past. One of the things that I think is a real opportunity in this moment, there is a polling firm that did a deep dive into attitudes around AI. There's a huge differential between how elites think about AI right now and the general public. Elites are very much thinking about how to deploy AI and use it in their day-to-day lives. What are the potential benefits to society, curing cancer, all of that. For the average public, it's like fear and risk and threat. And I think it's so important for us to be digging into that. I think the other piece, coming back to like why we're all here today, AI for a lot of people is just the most recent elite project to screw them over. And I don't think if we grapple with the deep anger about the economy and how it's failing people right now, and then just understand AI is layering on top of that, we're gonna really miss the moment in terms of, again, driving the kind of political will towards achieving the wins on shared prosperity that we need, and we'll only continue on down the pathway of accelerating concentrations of wealth into the hands of the few.
Yeah, amen. I mean, it seems really clear to me, at least, that there's some of the sort of the hot spots of political anger in this country right now are around data centers being built in people's backyards. And that's obviously a lot of that is about environmental concerns, resource concerns, but I think it's also a point of leverage that ordinary people have found with companies like xAI and OpenAI and Anthropic, where they can say, hold on, well, you don't get to build this job-killing thing in my backyard unless you are going to do it hopefully this is what one could say, unless you do it in a way that will benefit me, because this is my life and my livelihood and my dignity at stake. On that note, I want to ask, and we're sort of drawing to a close here, about how these policy solutions build power, and how are we thinking about centering workers in the policies, or even like democratizing AI? I don't know, Rand, do you want to start here? I see you nodding over there.
I think I've been nodding this entire time. So, but where there's smoke, there's fire. Again, I don't. It's a new technology, but it's not a new problem. We've failed these transitions many times in the past, including for TJ's father and parents, for Jo, during 2008 and 2009. So there's a lot of data to learn from. There's a lot of history to learn from. And the thing that has not occurred every previous time is that we haven't figured out what we're for. Like, a new technology is arriving, and we're afraid of it arriving, and perhaps we don't want it to. Perhaps we want to slow it down. But like, what positive vision can we push towards? And acknowledging that so much of work is already broken, rather than trying to step into a position of defense to preserve broken work. For example, Uber and Lyft drivers, since the first couple of years where Uber and Lyft were pouring tons of money into these platforms and paying drivers well to get them reliant on the platforms, that money's been withdrawn. So Uber and Lyft drivers are making not great money. Gas is more expensive than ever. Cars are more expensive than ever. This is really difficult work, and it can hurt your body. It can be stressful. Work so many hours. Like, I just don't want us to end up in a position of trying to preserve, as our best case scenario, those broken systems. And instead, I think the question is, if these technologies really could unlock new wealth separate from human labor, how do we share that? Like, how can government, which again regulates roads and vehicles and therefore can decide whether Waymo, Google's self-driving vehicle company, is allowed to arrive or not, how can government play a role and ensure that the wealth, again, helps people work less and earn more? And that answer has to come from drivers and their unions, but there's also a role to play for everyone else. And that's at least what we're trying to do in this sector, is come up with like tangible policies that driver unions can advocate for within states and cities that ideally leave them better off due to the emergence of technology in their industry. And if Waymo can't prove that it's going to leave them better off, then Waymo can't arrive.
Yeah. And what about you? How are you thinking about this in terms of like centering worker power or improving the sort of leverage or bargaining power of workers here?
Well, first I just want to echo what you're saying. I would have given a very similar answer, that, I mean, the first step, I think, is getting more voices involved in this conversation. Right now it does feel like the people developing this and having these policy debates are a tiny, tiny fraction, just that isn't representative of the population that this technology will affect. So there are a lot of assumptions being made about what we should be building, why, how, what people want, and I think we need to include more loud voices in terms of what people actually want. That would be step one. I do think there's an opportunity to, in this moment in time, to kind of use the anxiety and fear around AI, whether it's founded or maybe things won't be as bad as we think, who knows, to try to push some of the no-brainer policies that I think have been discussed way before AI became this big, narrative shift in today's discourse. And a lot of those things would help. Like I was saying earlier, reinforce our institutions. In terms of bargaining power, this is going to be hard. If jobs are lost, this is where a lot of people derive bargaining power. But today, we still have this bargaining power. And, I'm still seeing strikes happening that are very effective. I'm Canadian. I had trouble coming to San Francisco last time because Air Canada no flights were leaving at all, and I could not leave my country. We're still at a moment in time where we have a lot of power. This power we might lose more and more of over time, but this is the time to make asks and make demands while we still retain that power. And I think this will be the case for some governments as well, not just individuals, where I think like a large part of the world is likely going to get disempowered here as well. And so it's about leveraging this moment in time and not waiting for the data to roll in or for the bigger shocks to roll in to actually talk about, how we want, our society to be structured and work for its people.
We got to change who's getting to call the shots here, right? And right now it's the tech companies, it's not us. I joke that sometimes you read these articles around what's AI's impact going to be on the economy, and it's just like a lobbying game between the economists and the industry. And civil society is missing from this conversation right now. Like labor is like pushing itself in, but it's just not quite enough. So I think part of, again, how do we continue to build momentum to say whatever future comes, like we get to be in the driver's seat, right? Like that is what the moment calls for. That's the moment we look throughout history in which we have actually changed the game on our economy, actually pushed resources to the people who are the backbone of the economy, is because of labor unions, is because of organizing. It's because of people said the status quo is not working for us. And I think that's the call of the moment, which is both as we are living through this current day affordability crisis, in which, again, people are being squeezed so hard, and to say, you don't get to make this work because you want to play with some toys online, right? I'm being flippant here, but I think it's important to name. It's like there's not a lot of responsibility for what they're building and who it's going to impact. And I think it's not so much about slowing things down or changing the way it's said, but to say, like, actually, like, we just should be in a collective conversation here about how this technology is going to impact our lives. And again, I think it's going to take all of those things. Cash is a really powerful tool in this moment because we know that people cannot participate in democracy if they don't have some level of financial stability. And that's one of my fears, is this crisis is going to hit so fast that people aren't in a position to do the kind of pushing back that needs to happen. But we've heard it throughout today, right? When people are in economic crisis, that puts our communities in crisis, and that puts our democracy in crisis. So I think it's important for us to understand, again, this is both about people's financial futures, but it is also about the future of our democracy, right? We've beaten back the robber barons before. We can do it again.
Yeah, there's, I think Anna's right. There's so much of this is about the question of leverage, both in the sort of broad sense of how our movement can find leverage with these companies, whether that's about data center siting or whether it's about strikes and labor action. But, it was something we talked about yesterday, in fact, was the extent to which cash gives each individual worker some leverage with an employer, so that if they're trying to de-skill you or remove hours from your shifts or tell you that you have to use AI in a way that you know is going to make for a worse product, that you, because you know you are getting a check or because you know that you have enough to pay for groceries at home, can push back, and that you don't have to accept whatever is being handed to you because you don't have the power necessary for that. We've got a little more than 5 minutes left, and we have sort of been talking about this already, but I do want to end on as sort of positive or inspiring a note as we can. So you're saying we should push back. It's this moment. So how can we move this forward from like doom into action, Taylor Jo?
Yeah, probably didn't just pick it up from my last few comments. I actually am optimistic about potential applications for AI for the good. One of the things we've talked a lot about today, we're going to have to reform our tax code. We're going to have to figure out more resources. There is a possibility, and again, it comes back to who gets to decide here. There is a possibility that AI actually does free up capacity and lead to a level of productivity where people can lead fuller lives. And not to be named politician was sharing with us that on the stump, that when people ask him about AI and the ideas he puts on the table, one of them he talks about is like, well, we should explore a 4-day work week. The last time that we had this massive increase in productivity, but not the wages and income didn't keep up, the labor movement came to the table and said, great, we're going to demand a 5-day work week. Like, we have a whole history around that. So I think there's some real opportunity to say, if we gear this technology to actually do things like solve cancer and to actually free up people's time, there is a really positive potential technological future for us here. But power doesn't concede without demand. And I think that's the part we are, again, kind of missing from the conversation right now, is that future is possible if we demand it.
Yeah. What about you, Anna? What are you thinking about in terms of sort of concrete steps moving forward to take this to the next level?
Mm-hmm. I guess I really resonate with a lot of what you just said. Just to recap, there's a few no-brainer policies we spoke about to improve our welfare system. But I think beyond that, where I think maybe there is some hope is leveraging this moment in time to whatever we want to change to change it. And it's rare that we've had like major reform in our social institutions and welfare, like in times of peace and calm. Like we saw so many things that we today take for granted come out of like the Industrial Revolution or so forth. So even if it's just the anxiety of what's coming, maybe this is one thing that can shift political will. And then I guess like on the slightly more extreme end, if we do really see a lot of AI-driven labor automation, I think the incentives might shift that in a way that corporations and governments would be incentivized to do more redistribution, because otherwise, your markets are not going to keep working. Like there's going to be no one to buy the products the companies are building. So in a way, like even the people in power would be incentivized to redistribute in some way. Maybe it's cash transfers, maybe it's something else, but to kind of maintain the status quo, there might be incentives to inject more money into the economy or create jobs or do things so that more people can participate. Otherwise, they won't live in a future that serves them either.
Rayan? This has been so fun. I wish we could do this all day. Thanks, everyone, for being you and doing your work. I have two thoughts. One is on each side of this page. I'm going to do my best to get through them. I recently learned that in 1933, the US Senate passed a 30-hour-a-week work week, 30 hours a week work week. 40 hours is standard, and that was one around the same era during the New Deal. But the US Senate actually passed a 30-hour work week in 1933, and FDR basically shot it down. Disappointing. But I think,
unlike him.
Yeah, tough. Our heroes. The reason I found that so fascinating is it's something that we feel like, it feels like we can't even broach that conversation right now, what it would look like to have a 4-day work week, 3-day work week, a 30-hour work week, a 20-hour work week. Like these feel like impossible conversations when 100 years ago, before we had cars in every driveway, TVs in every home, before we had electricity dams damming most rivers across America, before we had highways instead of dirt roads, like we're 4 times more productive than we were in 1933 in 2026. And yet a 30-hour work week, which they almost made possible 100 years ago, has started to feel impossible. So that's one thing that I just want to emphasize is the things that we need, the things that we deserve, they are possible. In fact, some of them have almost happened before. There are previous eras who knew that they were possible. The other thing, like if I could be a genie for a day, the thing that I would wish for is that working Americans default to the belief, story, self-understanding that I run this shit. Like, this is my country. I built it. I sustain it every single day, and I deserve better from it. I've earned better from it. So again, if there were a genie and I could ask one thing, it would be that working Americans, every person in this room, every person that's in our family, our friends, that is their internal belief in their heart. Because I think that would start to change our politics and change our country and our sense of what we owe each other. And I think it would emphasize the fact that we're in this together. Like we really do depend on each other, so we have to take care of each other.
Yeah, I mean, it's hard to think of a better way to end than that. That's fantastic. Thank you guys so much for being such a great audience, and good luck out there.